Can I start with a question this morning? And it's this. When was the last time you had to say you were sorry? All the time. And I mean to someone close to you, someone that you love, not just because, you nudge someone with your trolley in Tesco's or something like that. I do that kind of apologising all the time. Yeah, sorry. When was the last time you properly had to say, I'm really sorry? The last time that you sought to put right something that you had done that was wrong. Now, chances are, as I'm even opening up this conversation, maybe you're even thinking of a moment where you've had to do a big sorry. You're feeling a little bit uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable even just recalling a moment like this. In the words of Elton John, sorry seems to be the hardest word. It takes courage to admit where your words or your actions or your lack thereof might have had a negative impact on someone else. It takes courage to reach out and to try and put it right. And for many of us, those moments where we have to say sorry, where we have to own up to our stuff, are a real stretch outside our comfort zone. And as such, we will always experience resistance. Many of us will experience resistance to actually doing it in the first place. It's funny, as I was prepping this talk, it dawned on me that I've spoken a number of times over the years about the topic of forgiveness, about how we are to forgive those who wrong us. And if you've ever listened to those talks or you've heard a talk on it, it can be really hard to forgive someone that's wronged us, even though Jesus is super clear about that our ability to forgive overflows from our understanding of how much God has forgiven us. So Jesus is really clear about how we need to forgive. And I've spoken about that, but I've never spoken about what happens when we are the ones that need to ask for forgiveness. I've never spoken about this before. And that's what I want to think about this morning. What happens when we are the ones that have been in the wrong? And I want to think about that as we get to this point in the story of Jacob, where Jacob needs to do just this. So we're going to be in Genesis chapter 33, if you want to turn to it. Can I put this stand up a bit? How do I do that? I won't do it because then halfway through the talk it'll go like that, and my notes will go over it. Thank you. I know I'm on the shorter side, but that's very short, even for me. So we're going to be in Genesis chapter 33. If you've got a Bible, you might want to get that chapter out. But if not, our lovely media team will be getting that on the screen for us in a minute. But just to backfill the story so far, if you're not familiar with the story of Jacob, maybe if you've not been here for the last couple of weeks. Now, Jacob, as a younger man, he betrayed his twin brother, Esau. Now, the name Jacob means deceiver. So that's a good description of Jacob at that point in his life, the one who deceives. And he steals the blessing of his father Isaac, a blessing that should have gone to his brother Esau, because Esau was the older son. Now, as I said, they were twins, so that age gap between them was actually very small. But if you read earlier on, it was Esau that was born first, then Jacob. And that, in those times, made all the difference in the world. Now, many of you will know that I'm a twin, and I'm, in fact, the older twin. Oh, yes. By 2 whole minutes, I hear you ask. So, and when I was young, when I was a child, I used to take a lot of pride in the fact that I was the older one. So much so that my twin sister, Chloe, many of you will know her, my twin sister twigged that the way to really wind me up was to say that she was the older one. So if we met someone and they'd, meet us as twins, and often a question people did ask, they don't ask it now, but they used to ask when you're little, which one of you's older? And she'd say, I am. And I'd say, no, I am. And she'd say, no, I am. And the poor person asking must have wondered what they'd walked into. But she knew it used to wind me up because it really mattered to me that I was the older one. In my mind, it gave me a little bit more social standing. Even though, of course, it wasn't a big deal, but it felt like a big deal to me. Now, to be honest, I'd happily claim that she was the oldest, those 2 minutes. But now, back in the Old Testament times, it really mattered who was the oldest in terms of your social standing, in terms of your inheritance. It was a big deal who was the oldest son. And this is what Jacob steals from Esau. And it's a weird story, but Jacob deceives Esau with his mother's help. He steals what was rightfully Esau's, and this all happens whilst their father is dying. So it's like a whole heap of dysfunctional family mess. So if you're in a whole heap of dysfunctional family mess right now, know that we can go to Scripture and find similar but different. Jacob then has to run away from Esau because Esau is so livid, he intends to kill Jacob. And then when Matt spoke here a few weeks ago now, he looked at that moment when Jacob has had to flee for his life. And he finds himself alone and apart from his family for the first time in his life. And he's in the midst of this mess, which has been a whole lot of his own doing. And he finds himself feeling alone and vulnerable. And it's in this moment that he encounters God for himself for the first time. And then Jacob then he carries on going, he has this massive encounter with God, and he ends up 500 miles away with his uncle Laban, whom he's never met before. But he goes, it's his mum's brother, 500 miles away, Uncle Laban. Now, Uncle Laban is clearly cut from the same cloth as Jacob, as a deceiver, because if you know the story, Laban marries Jacob off to the wrong daughter, not the one that Jacob actually wanted to marry. The irony of the story is that Jacob, the deceiver, becomes the one who is deceived. And there's that maturing process, I'm sure. So long story short, Jacob lives on his uncle's land for many years, and he amasses lots of wealth, wives, women, children, sheep, all the things. And then James then God appears to him in a dream and says, right, now is the time to then go back home. Go back those 500 miles, go home. James looked at last week this moment in the story where Jacob then has to really wrestle with fear. In that moment, literally then wrestles with God as he deals with this reality that is suddenly before him. Like he now has to head home to face his past. And this is the moment where Jacob is going to have to make amends and seek forgiveness from his brother Esau. And this is probably a moment that Jacob has been dreading, hiding from. Every time he thought about it, he thought, just don't think about it, for years. Because he didn't know if that moment would in fact ever even come. But sure enough, that moment does come. Like it is God's will that that relationship be put right. That Jacob should clear up his mess, if you like. And we see in Scripture, don't we, that these things matter to God. The Bible has a lot to say about our relationships with one another, how we do life together. The Bible speaks in clear terms that we need to love each other well, that we need to forgive those who wrong us, and also seek forgiveness from those whom we have wronged. For us to put things right as much as is in our power to do so. And none of that is easy. Some of you are like, I know how hard this stuff is. Like it's hard, isn't it? But our relationships, those with our families, our closest friends, with one another, they are almost like the testing ground, if you like, for the life that we have found in Jesus. They're a good indicator of where we still might be living as our old selves, with our stuff. And it's as we live among other people, as we do life among other people, that we often most clearly see the stuff that is still in us. It's okay with like a kind of a surface level friend to be your best cheery self. But it's with those that we live more deeply with that often our stuff comes out. Our anger, selfishness, insecurities, those places that we still need to allow God to transform us and break stuff off us. I can see that it's resonating. It's not just me with my stuff. Good. So if you want a real sense of where you're at in terms of your discipleship to Jesus, ask those closest to you how they experience you. That might be the best question you ask today. Some of you are like, I have no intention of doing that. It should give you a pretty good indicator, though, of where you are at in terms of being transformed more and more to look in character like Jesus. It's a big, brave question to ask. It might be the bravest question you ask this week. Our relationships with one another, as I said, are that testing ground for that new life that we have in Jesus. How we relate to each other matters to God. So let's just have a look at that moment when Jacob finally has to confront his past and reach out to his brother Esau. So it's Genesis 33. I'm going to read more or less the whole chapter, but it's a good one, so enjoy. It's a good story. Get this. Okay, so Jacob looked up. So he's traveled, he's ready to encounter. So here he is. Jacob looked up, and there was Esau coming with his 400 men. So this is Jacob, divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the two female servants. He put the female servants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear. He himself went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau ran to Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Then Esau looked up and saw the women and children. Who are these with you? He asked. Jacob answered, they are the children God has graciously given your servant. Then the female servants and their children approached and bowed down. Next, Leah and her children came and bowed down. Last of all, Joseph and Rachel, and they too. Last of all came Joseph and Rachel, and they too bowed down. Esau asked, "What's the meaning of all these flocks and herds I met?" If you remember in the bit James read in chapter 32, to try and sweeten Esau up, Jacob has sent a whole load of his flocks and herds on ahead. So he's saying, what was that about? And Jacob says, "To find favor in your eyes, my lord." But Esau said, "I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." "No, please," said Jacob, "if I have found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you have received me favorably. Please accept the present that was brought to you, for God has been gracious to me, and I have all I need." And because Jacob insisted, Esau accepted it. Then Esau said, "Let us be on our way, I'll accompany you." But Jacob said to him, "My lord knows that the children are tender, and I must care for the ewes and cows that are nursing their young. If they are driven hard just one day, all the animals will die. So let my lord go on ahead of his servant, while I move along slowly at the pace of the flocks and herds before me and the pace of the children, until I come to my lord in Seir." Esau said, "Well, then let me leave some of my men with you." "But why do that?" Jacob asked. "Just let me find favor in the eyes of my lord." So that day Esau started on his way back to Seir. Jacob, however, went to Succoth, where he built a place for himself and made shelters for his livestock. That is why the place is called Succoth. We'll end it there, but the next few verses go on about, he eventually ends up then in a place called Shechem, where he makes his home. It's a good story, isn't it? So Jacob, right at the beginning of that chapter, we read that he heads out to meet Esau. Esau with his 400 men, Jacob with only servants, women, and children. It must have been a terrifying moment for Jacob, don't you think? With his rather pathetic looking rabble behind him, to then have to walk forward and approach Esau, who was standing there with 400 men behind him. Jacob has no idea how his brother is going to respond. The only reason Jacob is there is out of obedience to God. He's doing it because God has asked him to. So this moment, you have to see, is totally out of Jacob's control. And as we think about what it means to seek forgiveness and reconciliation, I think it's often a feeling of lack of control that can stop us from doing it in the first place. Like, we don't know how the other person's going to respond. We don't know if they will accept our apology. We fear rejection or anger. On a side note, I do just want to speak into reconciliation and how it relates to forgiveness for a minute. As followers of Jesus, as I've said, we are all called to forgive and seek forgiveness. Regardless of how the other person may or may not receive that. We're all called to seek and to offer forgiveness. Whilst all moments of reconciliation will inevitably involve a level of forgiveness, not all forgiveness will end in reconciliation. Let me just say that again. Whilst all moments of reconciliation will inevitably require a level of forgiveness, not all forgiveness will end in reconciliation. Because when it comes to reconciliation, where there's been a relationship breakdown, which is often between two people or two people groups, which is often what happens, where there's relational breakdown, it's only possible to have reconciliation when then both sides opt in. Which is what actually we then see here, don't we? These two brothers, they meet each other. I mean, for the first time in years. They embrace, they weep, they talk. Esau gets to meet all of Jacob's family, which of course are his family. It's a beautiful moment, isn't it, those verses? It's powerful what happens. They're finally reconciled. But their reconciliation didn't just depend on Jacob. It depended on Esau too. Esau comes to Jacob ready to forgive and reinstate their relationship. So reconciliation takes both people willing to forgive and or be forgiven. Which of course is very different if someone just kind of cuts us off in that way and refuses to be reconciled to us. As an example, as I thought about this, many years ago, a friendship in my life, there was, as a friend of mine, and she was struggling to conceive, struggling to have a family. And when I found out I was pregnant with my first son, I knew that I was going to have a difficult conversation, which I did. But by all means, I did it in a really ham-fisted way. I didn't intend to, but I just did that really, really badly, even though my intentions were not to do it badly. When those ham-fisted, you're like, what was that? And at that point, that relationship then just started to break down to the point where she just totally cut me off. And that was really difficult because I knew I'd messed it up and I really wanted that relationship back. I'm the kind of person, I do not want to be at odds with anyone. And I really, really tried, and she just totally cut me off. And I had to get to that point when I thought, I'm not sure there's much more I can do. A year or so later, I saw her. I was driving along. I saw her walking down the street. I felt like a little prompting, so I thought, fine. So I messaged her to say, oh, hey, I just saw you, just thought I'd check in, see how you were doing. And she replied to say, sorry, who's this? Like, she deleted my number from her phone. And at that point, I just had to give it to the Lord and say, okay, I can't do any more than I've done. But that's painful, isn't it? I took comfort from Paul's word in Romans 12:18, as far as it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And I felt like I've done as much as I can, as much as it depended on me. I do also just want to add like a little pastor's note as we talk about reconciliation. I could do a whole talk on this, but I just want to add a note in so that no one mishears what I'm saying here. Where there's been a relational breakdown because of a deep trauma or abuse, seeking reconciliation or reinstating of that relationship will often not be wise or appropriate. So whether or not reconciliation is possible, or I said occasionally it's not advisable, every follower of Jesus, however, is still called to go on a journey of forgiveness towards the other person. And I said, that's not always easy, and we've done whole talks on that. If that's where you're at, we'd love to, pastorally support you and work through how you go on a journey of forgiving someone that has damaged you. We do a whole sozo prayer ministry. We can, speak to you into that if that's you here this morning. Now, it's worth saying, not all moments of seeking forgiveness and reconciliation are going to be on the scale that we read about today. Like, we may have a few of those in our lifetime. A lot of the time, those moments where we need to seek out forgiveness and put something right, they're much more kind of mundane, day to day, aren't they? But they are still really, really important. The truth is, when they feel like less important, we can kind of get very good at letting ourselves off the hook at seeking forgiveness. Anyone else ever told themselves this? They know that I'm sorry anyway. At least on some level. I don't need to say the words. Or they knew that I was just having a bad day and didn't mean to lash out. Or, hey, they owe me an apology too, so I'm going to wait for them to come to me. Anyone else ever told themselves, oh, it doesn't really matter, it'll be all right. We seem to be on good terms, it wasn't needed now. But you know what, I feel like as followers of Jesus, however much resistance we may feel, however tempting it may be just to skip over forgiveness, we need to get good at cleaning up our messes, at putting things right, even when we could get away maybe with not doing so. I think it's a really powerful way to live amongst each other and amongst the world around us. I want to share a little tool that I learned years ago as we think about, okay, well, how do we then do this well? Like, how do we then, seek forgiveness and reconciliation? So this is a tool that I found years ago, and I think it's really powerful. So firstly, we need to acknowledge that you've done something wrong. There we go. And you might want to write these down or take a note. I think this is a great tool. If you write it down, next time you have to say sorry, why not come back to this? So, acknowledge you've done something wrong. Now, that takes a lot of humility on our part, doesn't it? To acknowledge that you've messed it up. Think of Jacob approaching Esau. Did you notice it said in the passage he had to bow 7 times? So he didn't have to, he chose to. He bowed 7 times. Now, he's stolen the blessing and the rights as the firstborn from Esau. So technically, now in terms of how things stand socially, it's Esau that should bow to him. But Jacob comes to Esau bowing as a sign of humility and to show his heart posture towards Esau. And acknowledging that you were wrong can be really hard. Like, it's that moment where you have to swallow your pride, put aside any attempts at image management that you might be tempted to do, admit that you look weak and silly, and therefore feel vulnerable. That's difficult. Acknowledge that you've done something wrong. Secondly, get present to the impact of what you've done. So before you apologize, it's actually quite helpful to say, look, I know I was in the wrong. And then ask this question. I'm going to give you a power question that I think, this is a scary power question. I've already given you one scary question. I'm going to give you another. Ask the person, what was the impact of my actions on you? Ask them, what was the impact of what I did? And then listen to what they say. No one ever does that when they apologize. So when you do, they'll be like, what? It won't feel totally obvious, easy to say that. I once did this with one of my kids. Now, I was trying to think this week, I can't remember the exact circumstances, but I remember I told them off for something, I'd lost my cool. I'm sure no parents here have ever done that. I totally kind of overreacted to something and I told them off. And then I thought about it later on. I thought, actually, I feel a bit bad about that. I'm not sure that I'd reacted in the right way. I was probably acting out of something else, bringing my other stuff into it. So I went and found my son and I apologized to him. And I asked, darling, how did that make you feel? That's that question, but simpler, I suppose. What was the impact? How did that make you feel? And he was little at the time. And you know what he said? He said, in his little voice, I felt like you didn't listen, Mummy, or understand what was going on. Oh. But I learned something in that moment. And then when I apologized, I could really mean it because I suddenly knew what I was apologizing for. And you know what, just like, as I mentioned that moment with my friend years ago, sometimes we'll end up apologizing for our impact even when something wasn't our intent. So that's why you need to ask that question, to understand what the impact was. Thirdly, ask forgiveness. So now you know what you're actually apologizing for. And then make restitution. Try and put it right. Now, we don't get a good sorry moment in this passage. I wish we did. But Jacob does try and put it right. He makes amends to Esau, doesn't he, by sending on these flocks and these herds. He's trying to bless Esau. Having stolen a blessing from Esau, he's now trying to give him a different kind of blessing from all the ways in which God has now blessed him since. He insists in verse 9 and 10 in our passage, Esau, you keep it. You keep all that stuff. And then number 4, commit to doing differently next time. So say to the person, do you know what, next time, like with my son, next time I'll try and ask first what exactly is going on before I lose my stuff. What will you do differently next time? How? And then it's a good moment also to reflect. Like if you have those moments where you massively sit down with Jesus later and be like, okay, why did I respond in that moment? And Jesus, what is it you're pointing to in my life that you want to form more into your way? So use that model. Is there anyone, as I'm talking right now, that you're like, I need to say sorry? Anyone you need to be reconciled to? I hope you find that model helpful. And I think being a community, a type of person, a type of people that relate to each other and those around us in this way can be really impactful. Because not many people do this. Actually getting good at saying sorry has that power to be so transformational. It breaks cycles of unforgiveness and wrongdoing that we see all around us. Like we have a God who is making all things right and who cares when things are not so. A God who we're going to look at in a minute reconciled himself to us and calls us into a ministry of reconciliation. So in Genesis 33, we have this reconciliation moment between Jacob and Esau. And in some ways, it's a beautiful story. In other ways, a little bit unsatisfactory, I found. Did anyone else pick up on a couple of the flies in the ointment as we read it? So there's the moment as Jacob prepares to meet Esau and his 400 men, he puts his family in order of who he loves the most. Did you notice that in verse 2? Like, what? Verse 2, he put the female servants and their children in front, then Leah and her children, and then Rachel and Joseph at the back, because he thinks probably, oh, well, if Esau's going to, he's got 400 men here, so we don't know what's going to happen. If Esau does attack, then at least my favorite ones at the back stand a chance of survival. Imagine how everyone else felt. Oh, thanks a lot, Jacob, for that. Now, we're finishing looking at the life of Jacob today. We really only really looked at his middle life, if you know what I mean, over this series. Many of you will know, more famously, Jacob is famous for his sons, isn't he? And Joseph, his favorite son, who gets this special treatment by Jacob. And we all know, if you know the story of Joseph, even if you've just seen the musical, that it ends really badly, doesn't it? Jacob is going to end up mourning a son who he thinks has been murdered. Because of his issues here, because he's not sorting out his stuff. If you want an insight into why it's so important that we sort out our stuff, our mess, then maybe use Jacob as a good example. You kind of want to shout into the passage, hey, Jacob, sort out that favoritism issue. It's not going to end well for you. Secondly, as we read about, Jacob deceives Esau again. Because, if this was a Disney film, they've all reconciled, and then they're all going to go off, live together, lives happy ever after, amen, right? No. This is about real life and really messy people. Jacob pretends that his children and young flock require him to move more slowly than Esau. Esau says, okay, well, let me help you then. No, you go on ahead. I'm going to catch you up. Don't worry, off you go. It's all right, off they all go. To me, it reads in the passage that Jacob doesn't have much intention of actually ever going there. Instead, he settles at a place called Shechem. Why he does this is kind of open for suggestion. Maybe he's still fearful. We don't know. But the fact is that Jacob once again is less than honest with Esau. And so this chapter kind of slightly jars with that reconciliation moment that they've just had. It feels a bit unfinished, I think, a bit unsatisfactory. Although, interesting to consider that Jesus would one day reimagine this story and tell it in an altogether more complete way through the story of the prodigal son. You see, it's thought that Jesus uses this moment from Genesis 33 when Esau runs out and embraces Jacob. That was a story that his Jewish audience, that of course Jesus himself knew all too well. It's thought that he is referring to it when he then told his most famous story, the prodigal son, the story of a father embracing his wayward son who is returning home head held low in disgrace. In Luke 15, verse 20, this is what we read as Jesus tells this story in the moment that the son is almost home. It says this, But while that's the son, while the son was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. So Jesus seems to be taking this moment of reconciliation from Genesis 33, verse 4 in our passage, where Esau does the same thing. It said in verse 4, Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him. Do you see the similarity? These same three actions in both reconciliation story. The running out, the embracing, the kissing. So you see, the story of Jacob and Esau, however kind of incomplete it might feel, it's like a foretaste. It's a teaser, if you like, for the bigger, greater story that was coming. As Jesus told that story of the prodigal son, he used it to speak about how God the Father reconciled himself to humanity, mending the relationship that was broken between us and God. And that relationship was broken not because of anything that he had done, but because of all that we have done, our sin, our mess, our brokenness. And yet he was the one that sought reconciliation with us. He sought us out. He sought out a way for us to be reconciled to him, even though it was us that had wronged him, not the other way around. God the Father would run towards us. He embraces us. And so the gospel message is that whilst we were still far off, he came and met us in his Son and brought us home. That's the gospel message. 1 John 4 verse 9 says this is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love. Not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice, like in order to reconcile himself to us, as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. That is the gospel message, that we have been reconciled to God by grace. That's my story. That will be your story for many people here. And if that's not your story, we'd love to pray for you and introduce you to the God that wants to encounter you this morning. We have been reconciled to God by grace. We can be forgiven should we choose to receive this grace that he has made available to us through Jesus' death on the cross. And it is this embracing of grace that enables us to both forgive and seek forgiveness in our lives. Do you know this grace in your life? This grace that has the power to transform everything. I do just want to finish with one final thought, if I may, coming back to our passage. In verse 10, Jacob exclaims that when he sees Esau, it was like seeing the face of God. Did you notice that? He thought, that's a strange thing to say. Remember, Jacob's just wrestled with God, so he's kind of just seen the face of God. Now he meets Esau and he's like, oh, like seeing you is like seeing the face of God. He says, for to see your face is like seeing the face of God now that you have received me favorably. Interesting. What face do you think Jacob was expecting to see when he encountered Esau? Very different face, yeah. An angry face probably, fair enough. I mean, this twin brother had every reason to be livid with Jacob. But the face Jacob actually encounters is very different, so much so that it reminds Jacob of the face of God that he'd seen the day before. I mean, doesn't that give you hope? He sees something different in Esau's face. What does he see in Esau's face? Well, instead of seeing a face of anger, Jacob sees in Esau a face of forgiveness and reconciliation. Instead of a face of anger, Jacob sees a face of grace. That's the same for the prodigal son, returning home, tail between his legs, expecting to encounter a father whose face would be one of anger, disappointment, rejection. I mean, that's what the prodigal son is expecting to see. But instead, his father runs out to meet him. The son encounters in that moment, not a face of disappointment, anger, rejection, but a face of grace. When you think of God the Father, what kind of face do you see? Many of us will expect to see a face of disappointment or anger or sheer indifference. In fact, many of us who profess to know Jesus, to know this gospel of reconciliation, will mistakenly see that kind of face our whole lives when we think about God the Father. It's worth saying that if that is you, a lot of the time that's inherited from the face that we saw in our actual earthly fathers. Many of us will often see a face of anger, indifference, rejection, disappointment. That's not the face of God the Father when he sees you. The invitation this morning is to come and instead see his face of grace. Come, see his face of grace, his love for you, his reconciliation towards you. Like he wanted to make that relationship right between you and him, and that's why he died on a cross for you. He embraces you. And you're seeing his face of grace towards us as we come to him, acknowledging our need of him. It enables us to then be a face of grace to the world around us. Like the world needs the church to be a face of grace to the world around us. And unfortunately, often people's first encounter with Christians is not a face of grace. But when we encounter that grace, our faces get to shine, just like Moses' face shone when he encountered God. Our faces get to shine as a face of grace. We get to be people that forgive freely and easily, that know how to clean up our messes when it's us that needs the forgiving. And do it right in a way that is scary but actually matters. We get to be people that break the cycles of ungrace that we see all around us. Amen. Amen.